All right, this is what's considered a standard demographic profile. Children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on another. This is what most of the world looked like before the industrialization wave that occurred after World War II. But with globalization, this all changed because it used to be that we all lived on farms and you would have as many kids as you could put up with because they were free labor. Well, as many kids as you could put up with plus one, because that's how you find out it's too many kids. But when you take an industrial job, which international trade made possible, those were all in the cities. And as you move off the farm and into the cities, you have fewer of them because kids go from being a free source of labor to a massive expense and headache. And over the ages, the Korean demographic has shifted to this. The whole world has gone with the Koreans, starting from different points, going at different paces, but this has changed the economic structure of the world, because when you're a young system like this, it's all about raising kids and buying homes and buying cars and going to college. Young people do all of the spending in a modern economic system. That tends to make it very inflationary. But an older system like this, it's all about the high value-added workers who are doing everything they can to save for retirement. They've got decades of work experience, their incomes are high, their kids have moved out, so their expenses are low, and they're generating a lot of spare capital for whatever they need to do. What is going on right now is the world is changing from this to whatever is next. This was always the decade when a huge chunk of the world's advanced economies were going to age from this structure like Korea's today into the next structure, which is one where we have more and more retired people, where that bulge that has defined economic existence going back to the 50s moves into a non-economically viable state. So if a young demography is inflation-driven and growth-driven, and a more mature state like Korea today is investment-driven, technology-driven, infrastructure-driven, then whatever's next can't have consumption or production or capital, because retirees are sitting on their capital in the form of T-bills and cash. They're no longer working, so there's no consumption and there's no production. We all make that shift at different times, but for most of the advanced world, this is the decade it all goes down. Give you an idea of what the neighborhood looks like. Start with the United States. We've got the healthiest demographic structure in the world. That doesn't mean it's perfect. You can see the bulge of the baby boomers in their 60s, so we're going through the same aging process as everyone else, and digesting the boomers is going to be painful. But we also have the millennials down below, who are rounding out the labor force in a way that is allowing us to have a more inflation-driven system as opposed to deflation. You'll also notice that there's that big gap in the roughly 5 to 10-year-olds. That is a mix of two things, or three things. Number one, that's the Gen Xers kids. Small generation generates a small generation. Number two, it's the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. When people aren't sure of their prospects, they tend to have fewer kids. And third, it's the millennials doing everything that everyone has ever done before them, just with a 6-year delay. And so that was kind of the bottoming out of the birth rate. You'll notice it's already coming back, and preliminary data for 2022 and 2023 looks very positive. So we are looking at that base widening out again. But these shifts, these ins and outs of the demographic structures, they're actually going to be the single biggest factor that is shaping the labor force, our capital markets, and our economic structure for the next 50 years. And that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, because that's how it's been so far. The same holds true in Japan. On the whole, demographics shape destiny. But here, it's just that the birth rate has been so low for so long, they're well past the point of any sort of demographic regeneration. About all I can say that's positive for Japan is they've seen this coming and they've done some planning. Automation in life, not in manufacturing, in life, is more advanced in Japan than it is in any other places. They have robotic nurses, they've got hospital beds that turn patients. A lot of the stuff that doesn't require a lot of brains, but doesn't necessarily require eyes and hands, has been automated. And that's allowed Japan to age relatively gracefully. In addition, the Japanese, while they can't accept migrants because they have such a firm sense of culture, they have been able to expand spending on things like childcare and healthcare to encourage young families to have more children. It's met with some success. And so Japan, while it is still the oldest demographic structure on Earth today, it's no longer the most rapidly aging. Still in the top 10, don't get carried away. But Thailand, Korea, China, and Germany and Italy are all aging faster. Which brings us to Germany. This was always going to be Germany's last decade as an industrial power. They're aging too fast. They missed the point to turn the demographic ship of state 40 years ago. And they just haven't had much luck with immigration. In the 90s, they were able to bring in roughly 1 million people from the former Yugoslavia. That helped. And then about 10 years ago, they brought in about 1 million people from Syria. The problem with the Syrian refugees, once you move past the cultural disconnect, is that these people were unskilled labor and they were 85% male. They didn't bring their families with them. And so it's a shot in the arm, yes, but it's no assistance for long-term demographic regeneration. There's a hope, perhaps, that they'll be able to pick up about 1 million Ukrainian refugees who are relatively highly skilled. It would be an easier carry to culturally integrate them. But at this point, the demographic decline is so far advanced that by 2030, the Germans will no longer have the workforce that's necessary to do the things that we associate with Germany. And that assumes nothing else goes wrong. Nothing with Euro, nothing with relations with the United States in terms of trade, nothing with the Russians in terms of energy. And all of that is going wrong too. And then finally, we get the People's Republic of China. Now, this is already one of the fastest aging workforces in history ever. It's actually faster than the collapse of the workforces during the Black Death, during the Middle Ages in Europe. We also know that this is not the correct data. Only about 2-3 weeks ago, the Chinese released updated data that has since been incorporated into this graphic, showing that the birth rate has just collapsed. Since 2017, between 2017 and 2021, the birth rate dropped by 40%. And that's before you consider the anecdotals we have out of China, what went down with the COVID crash, suggesting that it's fallen even further. So we're already in a situation where we have roughly half as many children children 5 and under as we have children aged 10 to 15, which is well past terminal. It was already past terminal, but this is, you're looking at ethnic dissolution here with this sort of trend. And that assumes this data is accurate. The Shanghai Academy of Sciences is publicly trying to stir up discussion about how, because of the one-child policy, people have been over-reporting births and under-reporting different statistics, especially when it comes to labor, in order to make the local provinces look better. And they estimate that the Chinese system actually has 100 million fewer children than the data officially suggests. That probably means that that big gouge in the lower chunk actually plays up higher within the demographic structure, and those yellow bars probably don't exist at all. This is not a country in demographic decay. This is a country in the advanced stages of demographic collapse. And we don't have an economic theory as a species for what might make this work. It's obvious from the data that the Chinese have shared that consumption-led growth will never happen in China again. They actually saw a collapse in things like car sales back before COVID. They've never rebounded. And now, with the piss-poor recovery we've seen post-COVID in China, we now know that consumption is not part of the equation. This graphic indicates part of why. And we also know that while their labor costs have gone up by a factor of roughly 14 since the year 2000, their worker productivity has barely doubled in most sectors, and it's reached only triple in some of the more advanced ones. China is no longer the low-cost environment for manufacturing. It's just the place where all the industrial plant happens to be. Now, that's not nothing, but that's not enough to justify a long-term investment in the system. And every subsector that has tried to reshore out of China has discovered shorter supply chains with more effective labor, with lower energy costs, less political risk, closer to the end consumer. All right. on the off chance you don't buy the Chinese economic argument, I wanted to bring this graphic up. Now, for those of you who have been following me for a while, you know that back in 2014, I predicted that the Ukraine war would happen in 2022. Now, I don't say that to toot my own horn, although, but instead to underline that that was only one of 3 major global military campaigns that I saw shaping this decade. This graphic has the other 2. It's an oil flows graphic. So any country that has, let me back up. The yellow bars are total energy demand within each individual country. The green bars are net oil exports. The red bars are net oil imports. And you'll notice that the green bars and the red bars on the whole are inconveniently far apart. Right now, most tankers going from the Persian Gulf to Northeast Asia follow this purple line that follows the coast. Based on where you start and where you finish, that's 5,000 to 7,000 miles long. In a scenario where things in East Asia get a little punchy, the Americans do a trade embargo, the Chinese go for Taiwan or anything in between. The Chinese have the military capacity with multiple weapon systems to interrupt that purple flow line, which means in the case of war, the purple flow line won't be used. Instead, tankers will use this longer flow line that's deep sea. It's an extra 4,000 miles, but it avoids most of the weapon systems of most of the countries in play. The Chinese only have one weapon system that could reach that. They need satellite eyes on the target in order to hit the targets at that range. And the Chinese have no capacity for space combat, whereas Japan and the United States in particular have excessive abilities. So, in a post-globalized world, you should expect one of 2 things, or 2 of 2 things. Number 1, things in the Persian Gulf get a little dicey without the Americans there to hold the Saudis and the Iranians apart. That puts half of all global maritime oil flows in the crosshairs. And then number 2, you get a naval war in East Asia for any number of reasons. If oil flows use the green line instead of the purple line, the Chinese are screwed. They can't access that at all. But Japan has a fully blue water navy, even without its partnership with the United States. And those flows can be convoyed and protected. So whether it's because of demographics or political collapse in China or an energy conflict, the Chinese don't have a candle to hold up to this wind. We're going to see the end of the Chinese system within a decade, one way or another. All right, let's talk about the Russians. First, the map on the left, you're looking at the Russian space. The green zone, that's the Russian wheat belt. That's where everybody lives. The blue and the yellow are tundra and taigai for the blue and desert for the yellow, completely economically worthless. The problem the Russians have always had, however, is the beige. Territories that are flat, that are easy to invade through, but economically worthless, so there's no point in the Russians developing them. There's just too much territory for the Russians to guard. So the Russian strategy has always been to advance to a series of geographic barriers that you can't run a panzer division through, and then concentrate their relatively technologically inept forces in the access points between to prevent invasions from ever reaching in. Russia's been invaded 50-odd times in its history, and almost without exception, the only times that the foreigners have been ejected has been because of bad weather. It's very, very rare that the Russians on the ground have actually been the deciding factor when it comes to what the foreigners do. So from the Russian point of view, it's not just that Ukraine is some of the best land in the former Soviet Union. It's on the way to 2 of these most important access points, one in Poland, one in Romania. So the Russians were always going to try this. And when they're done with Ukraine, they're always going to push further. People forget that this is not the first post-Soviet war. It's the 9th. And all 9 of them were instigated by Moscow. This isn't Putin. This isn't Putin's current elite and cabal. This is Russian policy going back over 300 years. This war was always going to happen. And the demographic pyramid gives you an idea of why it had to happen about now. That big gouge in the 20-somethings. Those are the children who were born in the post-Soviet collapse. That's the last generation of Russia. Now, if you look down into the red zone, like the teenagers, especially 5 to 15, it looks like it gets bigger. It does by the official data, but about 15 years ago, when this number started to boost out, that's when the Russians stopped reporting how they were collecting the data. And a lot of circumstantial evidence from within Russia suggests that they just stopped collecting the data altogether and just started making it up. And that made their birth rate look better. Well, you should probably consider that big gouge in the 20s to be not just the last accurate data, but that probably drops straight down, meaning that roughly a third of the children in Russia just don't exist. So this is the last generation that the Russians have to even attempt to solve their territorial issues with military means. And so they are. All right, let's talk about where we are in the conflict right now. On the left, you have a population density map. On the right, you've got a transport map, mostly road, the dotted lines are rail. The areas that matter are actually not in Ukraine. This empty zone is the Artsakhan Desert. It's about the size of Utah. Nobody lives there. There's no infrastructure there. Here's the problem the Russians have. This arc is populated Russia, and it allows access not just to eastern Ukraine, but all the way down into the northern Caucasus, which is a territory that is most assuredly not populated in a majority sense by Russians. This is the land of the Dagestanis, the Chechens, the Agayevs, and so on. You'll notice that for the most part, the infrastructure follows the population patterns as you'd expect. So Russian control of the northern Caucasus is predicated on the concept of Russian control of eastern Ukraine. There's only one transport route of size that is an exception to that. It's the blue M4 line that is highlighted on the infrastructure map. Now, the most important places in the war are these two population centers. In the north, that's Belgorod. That's the city that served as the logistical and support hub for Russian activities in northern Ukraine, including the siege of Kiev and Kharkiv. And in the south, you have the city of Rostov-on-Don, which is not only a massive transit point for energy and agricultural shipments out of Russia, it's the only logistical and support hub for the entirety of Russian operations in the Donbass and especially the Crimea. If you remember the Kerch Strait Bridge, everything that goes over the bridge comes from Rostov. And then, of course, everything with the Donbass fighting as well. The problem the Russians have is if they lose control of Rostov, this war is over because they can't get forces into Ukraine. But if they lose control of Rostov-on-Don, they also lose control of the northern Caucasus. So a couple things to keep in mind here. Let's assume that, for argument's sake, the Ukrainians are wildly successful with the current counteroffensive, and they actually drive the Russians completely out of their territory by the end of the summer. Let's just assume that that happens. The Russians aren't going to stop. They see this accurately as a war for their existential survival. If they don't pacify Ukraine and the lands beyond in this conflict, then they will have a completely unmoored defensive strategy that has insufficient troops over the long run. And while I don't think the Germans are going to march into Russia anytime soon, this is the last chance the Russians have to get a more defensible perimeter. They will push until they can't, which means Ukraine, one way or another, has to end up in Rostov. They have to break up that logistical capacity so that the Russians cannot even try. And if they do that, Russia starts to dissolve because it loses control of not just its Ukrainian frontier, but its Caucasian one as well. So this last weekend when we had the Wagner coup, which we can talk about that as much as you guys want to, Wagner made its temporary headquarters the logistical hub of Rostov-on-Don. And for several days, all logistical and ammo support and fuel shipments to the entirety of the Russian front stopped. And the Ukrainians are taking advantage of that interruption right now.